She ripped every single flower out of that vase and hurled it straight at the doctor's face. Not because she was angry. Because the man standing at the foot of her bed had just told her in the calmest voice she'd ever heard that her legs were finished. Forever. Victoria Hayes, CEO powerhouse woman who had fought her way to the top of a ruthless industry, was never going to walk again. But here's what nobody saw coming. The man who would rebuild her life wasn't her wealthy fiancé, wasn't her business partner, wasn't anyone she'd ever chosen. He was a stranger sitting alone in a hospital hallway, and he heard everything. Drop a comment below, telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this kind of storytelling moves, you hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss them. The night it happened, Victoria Hayes was driving herself home. That alone should tell you something about the kind of woman she was. She had a driver on payroll, had used him every single day for 4 years. But that particular Thursday evening, she'd told him to go home early. She wanted the quiet. She wanted 30 minutes inside a car, where no one needed anything from her, where no phone would ring, where she could simply exist without performing. It was raining hard. The kind of rain that makes the highway look like a river. She had one hand on the wheel, the other wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee she hadn't touched since she left the office. The radio was playing something low, an old country song she half recognized, but couldn't name. She never saw the truck. Later, the investigators would tell her it had crossed 3 lanes in less than 4 seconds. The driver had fallen asleep. His rig was carrying industrial equipment. The trailer alone weighed over 40,000 pounds. Victoria's car, the sleek black sedan she'd leased 6 months ago, and was still paying off, folded like a paper cup. She didn't feel the impact. She didn't feel anything. She woke up 3 days later. Not slowly, not peacefully. She came back to consciousness the way a person breaks the surface of deep water, gasping, disoriented. Certain something was terribly wrong before she understood a single thing about where she was or what had happened. The ceiling was white. The light was fluorescent and too bright. Something beeped steadily to her left. And there was a man standing at the foot of her bed. He was in his 50s, wearing a white coat that looked like it had been pressed this morning, and he was holding a clipboard, the way doctors hold clipboards when they're about to deliver information they've delivered before. Clinically, with practiced distance, the way you hold something you don't want to drop, but also don't want to carry too long. Ms. Hayes. His voice was measured. I'm glad you're awake. Victoria's mouth was dry. Her throat felt like she'd been swallowing gravel. She tried to move, a simple instinct, just to shift her weight, adjust herself, and nothing happened. She tried again. Nothing. Ms. Hayes. The doctor set the clipboard down on the tray beside her bed. I need to explain your condition. Why can't I? Her voice came out wrong. Too thin. She stopped. Started again. Why can't I feel my legs? He told her. Quietly. Carefully. With the kind of compassion that doctors learn in training and then spend years trying to maintain when the reality of delivering terrible news starts wearing it down. He told her about the impact, about what it had done to her spine, about the specific vertebrae involved, the specific damage, the medical terminology that she heard and understood intellectually, and could not make herself connect to her own body lying in this bed. When he finished, she stared at him. So what does that mean? She asked. In plain English, what does it mean for me? He held her gaze. It means you won't walk again, Ms. Hayes. I'm sorry. There was a vase of flowers on the table beside her bed. Someone had brought them, she didn't know who. White lilies. The kind people bring to hospitals when they don't know what else to do. Victoria looked at them for exactly 3 seconds. Then she grabbed the vase with both hands and threw it directly at the doctor's face. He ducked. The vase hit the wall behind him and shattered. Water and lilies scattered across the linoleum floor. Nobody spoke. The monitors kept beeping. The monitors. Victoria stared at the broken pieces on the floor, and then something inside her chest caved in, completely. Not a dramatic collapse. Not the kind of thing you see in movies where a person screams and thrashes and makes the room shake. It was quieter than that. More terrible. Like watching a building after the last support beam gives way that half-second before everything comes down. She turned her face toward the window. And she cried. His name was Ethan Walker. He was 38 years old, though he could have passed for older on the harder days, and sitting in a hospital corridor at 10:30 on a Tuesday night was not a thing he did for fun. He was there because his buddy Ray, a former sergeant from his unit, who'd been fighting a bad knee for 2 years and had finally grudgingly agreed to let a surgeon look at it, had asked him to come. Just in case, Ray had said. In case I need someone to drive me home. Guilty. So Ethan was sitting in the corridor outside the orthopedic wing, drinking bad coffee from a paper cup and scrolling through nothing on his phone when he heard it. It started low, muffled. A voice behind a closed door, not a word, just a sound. The particular sound that human beings make when something inside them breaks and there's no way left to hold it in. He looked up. Room 114. The door wasn't fully closed. Someone had left it ajar, probably in a hurry, probably not thinking. Through the gap, he could hear it clearly now. A woman, crying in a way that had nothing performative about it. This wasn't crying for an audience. This was crying because there was nothing else left to do. Ethan sat very still. He was the kind of man who had learned through years of hard experience that people crying behind closed doors mostly wanted the door to stay closed. That grief was private. That inserting yourself into someone else's pain without an invitation was its own kind of violence. He stood up. Sat back down. Stood up again. He walked to the doorway and stood there for a moment looking at the floor. Then he knocked gently on the open door and stepped inside. She was turned away from him, facing the window. Her dark hair was tangled against the pillow. Both hands were gripping the edge of the bed railing so hard her knuckles had gone pale. The broken vase was still scattered across the floor. A nurse had apparently come and gone without cleaning it up, or maybe no one had been in yet. He didn't say anything immediately. He just moved carefully around the broken glass and pulled the plastic chair from beside the wall and sat down near the foot of her bed. After a long moment, she turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were red. Her face had that particular rawness that comes after real crying stripped exposed, like something that's been out in weather it wasn't built for. She looked at him the way people look at strangers who have just walked into their private catastrophe. "Who are you?" she said. "Ethan Walker." He held the paper cup in both hands. "I was sitting out in the hall. I heard..." He paused. "I figured the door being open was maybe an accident." It was. "I'll go." He started to stand. "Wait." He waited. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that it should have been uncomfortable, long enough that most people would have filled the silence with something useless. He didn't. "There's glass everywhere," she finally said. "Yeah." "The nurse is going to be annoyed." "Probably." She almost laughed. It didn't quite make it, but something shifted slightly in the air between them. "I threw a vase at the doctor," she said. "I figured it wasn't already like that when you got here." This time she did laugh, a short, fractured sound that had as much pain in it as anything else. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. "He told me I'll never walk again," she said, saying it out loud for the first time, to a complete stranger. Somehow, that was the only thing she could manage. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He didn't say "I'm sorry." Didn't say, "That must be so hard." Didn't reach for the rehearsed consolation that people offered, like spare change, something to give, so they didn't have to feel helpless. He said, "How long have you been awake?" "Maybe 20 minutes. "And the doctor came in and told you right away?" "About 5 minutes after I opened my eyes." Ethan set his cup down on the floor beside his chair. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. That's a hard way to get news, he said. Is there a good way? No, he admitted. But some ways are harder than others. She studied him, trying to figure out what he was, trying to place him into a category someone her fiancé had sent some hospital volunteer, some person with an angle she hadn't identified yet. Why are you still here? She asked. He picked his cup back up. Because you didn't tell me to leave. His name was Marcus Reed, and when he walked into her hospital room 2 days later, he was wearing the kind of suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was handsome. He'd always been handsome, the kind of handsome that came with money behind it, that had been groomed and refined and presented over years until it looked like something natural. He stood at the door for a moment, looking at Victoria in the bed, and she could see the specific calculations happening behind his eyes. She'd always been good at reading him. She'd thought that was intimacy once. Now she recognized it for what it was. Assessment. Victoria. He came to the bedside and leaned down to kiss her cheek. She let him. God, I got here as fast as I could. It's been 5 days, Marcus. A pause. Something flickered across his face. The partners' meeting ran long, and then the Singapore deal. I know. She looked at him. I know. He pulled the chair close and sat down. He reached for her hand and held it both of his around hers, the gesture he always used when he wanted to seem like he was being sincere. The doctors briefed me this morning, he said. Good. Victoria. He exhaled slowly. This is going to be a process. A long one. I know that. I've been thinking, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. I've been thinking that maybe the best thing, at least in the short term, is for you to step back from the firm, just temporarily, while you focus on recovery. She looked at their joined hands, his warm and smooth, hers still marked with fading bruises from the IV lines. Step back, she repeated. The partners are concerned. The clients are asking questions. There's a perception issue, Victoria. It's nothing about you personally. It's just... Who suggested it? What? Who suggested I step back? Was it Harrington? Or did you come up with that yourself? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm trying to protect you. From what, Marcus? He didn't answer. She pulled her hand back. Thank you for coming, she said. Her voice had gone flat, controlled. The voice she used in boardrooms when she needed to close something down. I'm tired. He stood slowly. He looked at her, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something genuine in his expression. Something that might have been guilt. Then it was gone. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. She didn't answer. He left, and she lay in the bed in the silence he'd left behind, and she understood with the specific, terrible clarity of someone who can no longer afford to believe comfortable things that she was alone. Ethan came back the following evening. He didn't call ahead, didn't explain himself. He simply appeared in her doorway at around 7 p.m. with 2 cups of decent coffee from the place across the street, not the hospital dreck actual coffee, and said, You look like someone who drank the real thing. She stared at him. You don't know me, she said. No. He set 1 cup on her tray table. But I've had hospital coffee, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. She looked at the cup, then at him. You were in here 2 days ago, she said. Yeah. You didn't have to come back. I know. So why did you... He sat down in the same chair, the plastic one. He held his own cup in both hands the way he had before, that same gesture, like he was warming himself on it. I lost my wife 4 years ago, he said. Not like he was trading pain for sympathy. More like someone laying a card on the table so the other person understood what they were holding. Cancer. She was sick for about 18 months before she died. And in those 18 months, I watched everyone around her, everyone who claimed to care about her, slowly, quietly disappear. They didn't mean to. I don't think most of them even realized they were doing it. He paused. But she noticed. Victoria was very still. She told me once, Ethan continued, that the hardest part wasn't the sickness. It was realizing that the people she'd built her life around couldn't handle watching her be sick. That being around her made them uncomfortable. That her pain reminded them of things they didn't want to think about. He looked up from his cup. "I watched a man leave your room this morning," he said. "Expensive suit. Came in, stayed about 10 minutes, left." He paused. "I don't know who he is to you. Maybe I'm reading it wrong." She didn't say anything. "You don't have to tell me," he said. He stopped, started again. "I just know what it looks like when someone's about to become very alone, and I thought maybe—" He seemed to catch himself, pulled back slightly. "I thought maybe another cup of bad coffee would at least take the edge off." Victoria looked at the cup on her tray table. Then she looked at this man, this ordinary, tired-looking man in a worn jacket with honest hands and the specific kind of steadiness that only comes from having already survived the worst thing you could imagine. "He's my fiancé," she said quietly. Is. I don't know what the right word is anymore." "Okay." "He wants me to step down from my company." "While I focus on recovery." She said the phrase like it tasted wrong. "What do you want?" The question surprised her. Such a simple thing. Such a rare thing. "I want to go back to work," she said. "I want to finish the investigation I was running before the accident. I want to—" Her voice caught. She pressed forward through it. "I want to be useful. I want to matter. I want to stop feeling like something that happened to me has turned me into someone other people get to make decisions about." Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds like someone who's not even close to finished," he said. She looked at him. "Your legs won't carry you right now," he said. "But that doesn't mean you're not going anywhere." He paused. "And if you need someone to help you get where you're going—" He stopped, seemed to consider the weight of what he was about to say, said it anyway. "I'll be your legs." The room was quiet. Outside in the hallway, a cart rattled past. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped. Victoria Hayes, woman who had built a company from nothing, who had fought her way into rooms where no one had wanted her, who had never once in her adult life accepted help she hadn't earned, looked at this stranger sitting in a plastic hospital chair with a paper cup of decent coffee. And for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, she believed him. She had no idea in that moment what she was walking into. No idea who had actually arranged for that truck to be on that highway on that rainy Thursday night. No idea that the man she'd planned to marry was carrying a secret that would eventually cost him everything. And no idea that the quiet, steady man sitting across from her was about to become the most important person in her life. But that story was just beginning. The rehabilitation center smelled like antiseptic and effort. That was the only way Ethan could describe it when he walked through the front doors for the first time. Not the sharp clinical smell of the hospital, but something underneath it. Something human. The smell of people working against their own bodies. Of pain being converted slowly and imperfectly into progress. Victoria had been transferred 3 days after their conversation in the hospital room. She hadn't asked Ethan to come. He came anyway. He found her in the physical therapy room at the end of the east corridor, a wide, pale-walled space with parallel bars running down the center and various pieces of equipment arranged around the edges. She was in her wheelchair near the window, and a therapist named Dana was crouched in front of her, speaking quietly and demonstrating something with her hands. Victoria's face was the careful, composed expression of someone who had decided that the way to survive something unbearable was to make it look like it wasn't unbearable. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. Every line of her body said, "I am handling this. Do not look at me like I am not handling this." Ethan recognized that expression. He'd worn it himself once in a different room in a different kind of war. He didn't interrupt. He sat down in the waiting area near the door and picked up a magazine he didn't read and stayed there until the session ended 40 minutes later. When Dana walked away to get something from her station, Victoria turned her wheelchair and saw him. She didn't look surprised. She looked something more complicated than that. You followed me to a different facility, she said. I know where the good parking is here. That's not a reason. It's a reason. She rolled toward him slowly, still learning the rhythm of it, he could tell. The way her hands worked the wheels with more force than was necessary, overcorrecting slightly the effort visible in her shoulders. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him with the direct evaluating gaze he was starting to recognize as her default setting. The look of a woman who had spent years reading rooms and people and situations, deciding what was real and what was performance. My assistant called this morning, she said. 2 of my senior investigators put in their notice. Apparently there's a rumor that the firm is going under. Is it? Not if I have anything to say about it. What are you going to do? I'm going to call them myself. Today, after this. She glanced back toward the therapy room. After I learn how to transfer myself from a wheelchair to a regular chair without assistance. A pause. Which, as it turns out, is significantly harder than it sounds. Did it go okay, the session? She was quiet for a moment. The composed expression held, but something moved behind it, a flicker of something real, the kind of thing that slips through when a person's guard drops by a fraction of a degree. I fell, she said. Just that. No elaboration, no cushioning. Dana caught me, she added. But I fell. Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't offer sympathy, didn't rush to fill the space with something reassuring. He just let the words be what they were. First time's always the worst, he said after a moment. You speak from experience. I was a mechanic in the Army, 3rd deployment. I took some shrapnel in my right shoulder, spent 6 weeks in PT trying to get the rotation back. He paused. First time I tried to lift my arm above my head, I got about halfway, and my vision went white. Thought I was going to pass out in front of a room full of people. He glanced at her. Which would have been significantly worse for my ego than for my shoulder. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Did it come back, as she asked? Full rotation? Mostly. He rolled his right shoulder slightly. About 90%. Good enough. Good enough, she repeated, like she was trying the phrase on seeing if it fit. He looked at her directly. Yeah, sometimes good enough is what you're working toward, and it's more than you had yesterday. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she straightened slightly in the chair and said, I need to make those calls. Is there somewhere in this building where the signal doesn't cut out? East stairwell, he said immediately. I tested it while you were in therapy. Now she did smile. Small, guarded, but real. You're a strange man, Ethan Walker. I've been told. The calls took 2 hours. Ethan waited in this corridor outside the small consultation room she'd commandeered, drinking coffee from the machine down the hall and reading actual news on his phone for the first time in days. He could hear her through the door, or not the words, just the cadence. The voice of a woman who was absolutely not asking for anything, who was telling clearly and without apology exactly how things were going to go. The 2 investigators didn't quit, she told him afterward, when she rolled back out into the corridor with her phone pressed against her thigh and her chin slightly higher than it had been 2 hours ago. I gave them both raises, she said. Smart. I also told them I'd be running the Holloway case from here for the next 2 weeks, and I expected daily reports. She glanced up at him. Holloway is the pharmaceutical investigation, the one I was working on before the accident. Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. How long were you running it before the crash, he asked. 8 months. She paused, seemed to make a decision. It's bigger than I originally thought. We started with one company irregularities in their clinical trial data. Standard stuff. The kind of thing that happens more than people realize and usually gets settled quietly. But the further we dug, the more it kept connecting to other things. Other companies, other trials, people who were paid to look the other way. She stopped. There are names in this investigation that are going to surprise people. What kind of names? She looked at him steadily. The kind that make lawyers very nervous, she said. He nodded slowly. He didn't push. He'd learned in the 2 weeks of visiting her first at the hospital now here that Victoria Hayes shared information on her own timeline in her own way, and that the fastest way to get her to close down was to pressure her toward anything she wasn't ready to say. "You want to grab lunch?" he asked instead. "The cafeteria here is genuinely terrible. There's a diner 2 blocks up that has decent soup." She blinked, like she'd been bracing for something entirely different, and the pivot had caught her off guard. "It's accessible?" she asked, a beat. Then with a slight edge, "The diner, not a question I used to have to ask." "I checked," he said simply. "Wide doorway 1 step at the entrance, but they have a portable ramp, tables are the right height." She stared at him. "You checked," she said. "Before I suggested it." There was something in her face then that she didn't quite manage to hide, something that moved through her eyes and was gone quickly, but not quickly enough. Something that looked, if he had to name it, like the specific pain of being genuinely surprised by basic consideration. The pain of realizing how long you'd gone without it. "All right," she said after a moment. "Soup sounds fine." "Nah." It was during their 3rd week of Ethan appearing at the rehabilitation center of cafeteria food and diner soup, and long conversations in the consultation room she'd made her temporary office, that Marcus showed up. Victoria had just finished a grueling 2-hour session. She was exhausted in the specific layered way that physical therapy produced. Not just the body worn out, but the mind too. The concentration required to make recalcitrant muscles perform unfamiliar tasks, taking something out of her that she hadn't expected. She was in her room, her phone on the tray table, and her eyes closed when she heard the door. She assumed it was a nurse. Then she heard the particular sound of expensive shoes on linoleum. She opened her eyes. Marcus stood in the doorway. Immaculate as always. His hair was perfect. He was carrying absurdly a small arrangement of flowers, not the sad gas station kind, but actually beautiful ones, clearly from a proper florist, which somehow made it worse. "Marcus." Her voice came out flat. "Victoria." He came in and set the flowers on the table beside her. He looked her over comprehensively, the way he assessed things, and she could see him processing the wheelchair folded near the wall, the equipment arranged on the shelf, the particular geography of her life now. His expression was careful, concerned, practiced. She hated that she could see the practice in it. "You look good," he said. "Don't." "I mean it." "You don't," she said, "and we both know it. So let's skip to whatever you actually came to say." He pulled the chair close and sat. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, his sincere posture, she thought. The one he used in negotiations when he wanted the other side to believe he was being completely open. "I've been thinking," he said. "Congratulations." "Victoria." "Marcus." She kept her voice even. "I've been in this center for 3 weeks. You've called twice. You came to the hospital once for 10 minutes and suggested I step down from my own company." She looked at him. "So whatever thinking you've been doing, I need you to be very honest with me about what it's actually about." He was quiet for a moment. To his credit, he didn't immediately reach for a denial. Something in him seemed to settle, like a man deciding to put down something heavy, at least temporarily. "The firm is going to be difficult to maintain," he said. "With everything." "The firm is fine." "The partners." "I spoke to the partners." He paused. "When?" "Last week. All of them. Individually." She held his gaze. "I run my company, Marcus. That doesn't change because I'm in a wheelchair." Something moved across his face. She couldn't quite read it. "This is bigger than the firm," he said carefully. "The investigation you were running." And there it was. She felt it, not a dramatic thing, not a cold chill like in the movies, just a quiet, terrible clarity. The way a lock sounds when it finally opens after you've been trying the wrong key for too long. She kept her face completely neutral. "What about the investigation?" she said. "I just think—" He stopped, started again. Given everything that's happened, given your recovery, it might be time to close some of the open cases. Pass them off. The Holloway matter. Especially it's been dragging for months, and without you fully operational. I am fully operational. Victoria. I'm sitting in a different position than I used to, she said. That's the only thing that changed. Marcus stood. He moved to the window, the same place she'd been looking 3 weeks ago when she'd first understood how alone she was going to be. I love you, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever you think, whatever. I need you to leave Marcus. He turned. I'm serious, she said. I'm asking you to leave, and I think... She stopped, looked at her own hands in her lap for a moment. I think you should take some time to think about whether what you're feeling is love, or whether it's something closer to fear. He stared at her. Fear of what? I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I'm going to find out. He left. And she sat in the quiet of the room afterward, turning over what he'd said. Not the emotional weight of it, but the specific content. The specific case he'd named. The specific urgency with which he'd wanted her to close it. The Holloway matter especially. She picked up her phone. She called her lead investigator, a methodical, relentless woman named Sandra Chen, who had been with the firm for 6 years, and who didn't know the meaning of the word subtle when it came to digging through financial records. Sandra, she said when the call connected, pull everything we have on Holloway. Every financial record, every connection, every name in the chain. I want it cross-referenced against the Reed Group. A pause on the other end of the line. Marcus Reed's family company, Sandra said. Yes, Victoria said. Start tonight. She didn't tell Ethan about the call right away. She told him about Marcus's visit, most of it. The flowers, the conversation, the request to close the Holloway case. She told him sitting across from him in the diner, 2 blocks up over soup. She didn't finish watching him listen, the way he always listened completely, without interrupting, without deciding what he thought before she'd finished speaking. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. He specifically named the investigation, Ethan said. Yes, not the other cases, not the general workload, that one. Yes. And you two were together for how long? 3 years. She looked at her bowl. Engaged for 8 months. He nodded slowly. Had he ever shown interest in your cases before the specifics of your work? He knew the firm existed. He knew what we generally did. But no, she paused. He didn't care about the details. He thought corporate investigation was unglamorous. Too much paperwork, not enough visibility. She stopped again. He liked that I ran a successful company. He wasn't particularly interested in what the company actually did. But he knew the Holloway case by name. She met his eyes. He knew it by name, she confirmed. Ethan picked up his coffee cup, held it. Victoria, he said carefully. I'm not someone who jumps to conclusions. I believe in evidence. He paused. But I think you should be careful. I'm always careful. More careful than usual. He set the cup down. And I think... He stopped. Looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that she'd come to rely on without quite realizing it. I think whatever you're looking for in those records, you should have someone you trust completely handling it. Not just someone competent. Someone whose loyalty isn't in question. She studied him. I have Sandra, she said. Good. Keep it between you and Sandra until you know what you're looking at. He paused. And Victoria. She held his gaze. Whatever you find, prepare yourself. For what? He looked at her steadily. For the possibility that the worst thing you're afraid of might be exactly what happened. The diner was warm. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made everything look briefly golden, briefly gentle, briefly like a world in which the worst things you were afraid of didn't actually happen. She looked at Ethan across the table. This quiet, ordinary man, who asked for nothing, who checked the accessibility of restaurants before suggesting them, who sat in hospital corridors, and came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. She thought about what it meant to trust someone. Not to need them, not to depend on them, not the complicated transactional math that had defined most of her relationships, including the one she'd been planning to build a marriage on. Just to trust. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll be careful." He nodded. Outside, the afternoon was starting to cool. She had therapy at 9 the next morning, the kind that had made her fall twice last week. The kind that Dana kept telling her was progress, even when it felt like the opposite. She had reports coming in from Sandra by midnight. She had a company to run from a chair in a rehabilitation center, using a phone and sheer force of will and the stubborn, bony deep refusal to accept that what had happened to her body was the final word on what her life was going to be. Yeah. She had all of that ahead of her. And sitting across the table from her was a man who had never once in all the weeks she'd known him looked at her like any of it was too much. Like she was too much. She was beginning to understand a rarer thing than she had ever realized. Her phone buzzed on the table. Sandra. She looked at the screen, then at Ethan. "I have to take this," she said. "Go ahead," she answered, listened. And as Sandra's voice came through the line, careful, measured, carrying the specific weight of information that changes things, Victoria's expression went completely, absolutely still. "Send me everything," she said. "Tonight." She ended the call. Ethan was watching her. "Well," he said. Victoria Hayes set the phone down on the table. "Marcus Reed," she said quietly, "is listed as a silent stakeholder in 3 of the shell companies we've been tracking through the Holloway investigation." The diner hummed around them. "That's not a coincidence," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. Her voice was calm. Her hands were steady. Everything on the surface was completely professionally controlled. And underneath it, something was breaking. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. The way things break when you've been hoping against all reasonable evidence that they wouldn't, and then reality arrives and confirms that hope in this particular case was the thing you shouldn't have held on to. "He knew," she said. "That's why he wanted me to stop." Ethan said nothing. "He was there," she continued, "in the investigation, connected to the people I was investigating, and I was getting close and he knew I was getting close and so he—" She stopped. She couldn't say the next part yet. Not out loud. Not tonight. "You don't have to figure out all of it tonight," Ethan said, quietly, like he knew exactly where her thoughts had just gone. She looked at him. "No," she said. "Tonight you know what you know. Tomorrow you get more, and then you decide what to do with it." She nodded, slowly. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was fading. The street was settling into the particular quietness of early evening when the city shifts gears between the workday rush and the night ahead. She thought about Marcus, about 3 years, about the ring she'd taken off in the hospital and put in the drawer of her bedside table and not looked at since. She thought about what it meant to discover that someone you'd built a future around had been all along building something else entirely. And she thought about the accident. About that rainy Thursday night. About a truck that had crossed 3 lanes in less than 4 seconds. She didn't say it yet. But the thought was there. Sitting at the edges of everything she knew, patient and terrible and waiting. Sandra's files arrived at 11:47 that night. Victoria didn't sleep. She hadn't expected to. She sat in her room at the rehabilitation center with her laptop open on the tray table and her phone beside it, and she went through every document Sandra had sent with the same methodical, relentless attention she'd been applying to investigations for 12 years. The same attention that had built her firm. The same attention that had made powerful people nervous and made her very, very good at her work. It took her 4 hours. By 3 in the morning, she had read everything twice. She had cross-referenced names, traced financial connections through 4 layers of shell companies' matched dates against the timeline of the Holloway investigation, and built in her mind a picture that was coherent and complete and absolutely damning. Marcus Reed's family company, the Reed Group, 3 generations old, worth somewhere north of $800 million, had a quiet, carefully obscured financial interest in Palladian Pharmaceuticals. Palladian was the parent company at the center of the Holloway investigation, the one whose falsified clinical trial data had potentially caused the deaths of dozens of patients across 7 states. The one that had been paying researchers to alter results, paying regulators to look the other way, paying lawyers to bury complaints before they became lawsuits. The connection wasn't direct. It never was with people who could afford to be careful. It ran through 3 shell companies registered in Delaware, through a holding entity based in the Caymans, through 2 investment vehicles whose ownership was listed as a management trust with no named beneficiaries. But it was there. Sandra had found it because Sandra was extraordinary at finding things people didn't want found. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Marcus had known about Palladian's exposure before Victoria's investigation began. She could see that now in the paper trail. A series of internal communications forwarded to a private email address. An address she was willing to was connected to Marcus, though proving that connection would take another layer of work. Emergency board meetings. Legal consultations. The specific choreography of people who know a problem is coming and are deciding how aggressively to make it go away. And then 8 months ago, Victoria's firm had been retained to investigate Holloway. 8 months ago. The same week she and Marcus had gotten engaged. She sat with that for a long time. She sat with the specific geometry of it, the way the pieces fit together, the way a man who loved her, or said he loved her, or had convinced himself he loved her, had looked at the timing and made a calculation. Had decided that the safest place to have a problem was close. Had decided that inside the tent was better than outside it. And then the accident. 6 weeks ago. She was getting close. Sandra had told her that in their call 3 weeks before the crash told her they were maybe 2 months from having something solid enough to bring to the federal investigators they'd been quietly coordinating with. Close enough that the right people were beginning to understand it was serious. And 6 weeks before the finish line on a rainy Thursday night, a truck driver had fallen asleep and crossed 3 lanes of highway. Victoria closed her laptop. She sat in the dark of her room, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way Dana had taught her the breathing technique that was supposed to help with the anxiety that physical therapy sometimes triggered. She used it now for something different. She used it to stay inside herself when what she wanted was to get very, very far away from what she was thinking. Because what she was thinking was monstrous. And she needed to be sure. She called Ethan at 6:15 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd either been awake already or was the kind of man who slept lightly enough that a 6 a.m. call didn't produce the groggy, disoriented response most people would have. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not at the center, somewhere else." A pause. "Are you okay?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm not in danger. I just need to—" She stopped. "I need to say this out loud to someone who will tell me if I'm losing my mind." "I'll be there in an hour," he said. She didn't tell him he didn't have to come. She'd stopped saying that. He came in 55 minutes. They went to the diner. The morning shift was just starting, and the place was quiet and smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and the specific optimism of early hours that hadn't gone wrong yet. They took the corner table, the one that gave her room to position the wheelchair without blocking the aisle, and Ethan ordered 2 coffees without asking her preference, because by now he knew it, and he looked at her across the table and said, "Tell me." She told him everything, all of it. The shell companies, the financial connections, the timeline, the forwarded communications, the engagement and its timing, and finally, the last piece. The one she'd been carrying since 3 in the morning, like something radioactive. The accident. She laid it out the way she would have laid it out for a client. Factually. Sequentially. Without editorializing or reaching beyond what she could actually support. When she finished, the coffee in front of her had gone cold. Ethan hadn't spoken once during the 20 minutes it took her to say it all. He'd just listened. His face had gone through several things she'd watched without commenting on something hardening behind his eyes. When she described the shell companies, a tightening around his jaw, when she got to the timing of the engagement, and then when she reached the accident, something she could only describe as the way a man looks when he has suspected something terrible and just had it confirmed. "Say the last part again," he said quietly, out loud. She understood what he was doing. He was making her say it. Because saying it was different from thinking it. Saying it made it real in a way that thinking never quite did. She looked at him directly. "I think Marcus Reed or someone connected to Marcus Reed and the people protecting Palladian arranged the accident," she said. "I think someone made that truck driver fall asleep at the wheel on that specific stretch of highway on that specific night. And I think it was because I was 6 weeks away from destroying their operation." The diner hummed around them. A waitress refilled someone's cup 2 tables over. Ethan sat very still. "That's not losing your mind," he said. She exhaled slowly. "It could be," she said. "I could be building a narrative out of coincidences. I know how that works. I've seen it happen in investigations where someone gets deep enough into the material that the pattern recognition starts running ahead of the evidence. I could be doing that." "Are you?" "I don't know." She looked at her hands. "I know the financial connections are real. I know the timeline is real. I know Marcus asked me to close this specific case. What I don't know..." She stopped. "What I don't know is whether what happened to me was a tragedy or a crime." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is there a way to find out?" "Yes," she said. "Sandra's already working on it. We need the truck driver's financials, his phone records, any connection between him and anyone in Palladian's network or the Reed Group. That's traceable. It just takes time, and it takes someone who knows what they're looking for." She paused. "The federal investigators we've been coordinating with are going to need to know. This goes beyond corporate fraud now." He nodded. "When are you going to tell them?" "When I have something solid enough that it can't be buried." She met his eyes. "I've seen what happens when powerful people feel cornered. They don't just defend themselves, they attack. I need to be ready before I move." Ethan considered this. "Okay," he said. "What do you need from me?" The simplicity of it landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. Not "are you sure?" Not "this is a lot, Victoria." Not any of the hedging, qualifying, conditional support she'd experienced from everyone else in her life since the accident. Just "what do you need?" "I need someone who's not on anyone's radar," she said. "Someone who can make calls, move things, be present in places where my name would attract attention." She paused. "I need someone Marcus doesn't know and wouldn't think to look for." "I can do that." "Ethan." She stopped. "This isn't safe. If what I think happened actually happened, these are people who have already demonstrated they're willing to..." "I heard you the first time," he said. "What do you need?" She looked at him for a long moment. "My firm has a contact, a private investigator, former FBI, named Garrett Walsh. He's been running field operations for us on Holloway since the beginning. He doesn't know about the Reed connection yet. I need someone to go meet him in person and hand-deliver documentation. Not email, not phone. In person." She held Ethan's gaze. "I'd ask Sandra, but Sandra's name is in the investigation files, and I need her on the records. You're invisible to them." "Where?" "Chicago," she said. "He's based out of Chicago." Ethan nodded. "When?" "Thursday." "Okay." She studied him. "You're not going to ask me any of the questions most people would ask." "Such as?" "Whether I'm sure. Whether this is worth the risk. Whether I've thought about what happens if I'm wrong." She paused. "Whether I've thought about what happens if I'm right." He picked up his coffee cup, looked at her over the rim of it. "You've thought about all of those things," he said. "I can see it on your face. You've been up since midnight running every version of this. You don't need me to ask you the questions you've already asked yourself." He set the cup down. "You need someone who's going to help you move." She looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly what I need." Marcus came to the rehabilitation center on a Wednesday afternoon. Victoria knew he was coming. He'd called ahead, which itself was notable because Marcus Reed was not a man who typically announced himself. He arrived. Things arranged themselves around his arrival. The calling ahead was a signal, though she wasn't sure yet of what. She was ready. She'd spent the morning in therapy, brutal necessary, the kind that left her arms burning and her mind scraped clean of everything except the work of existing in her body. She'd spent the early afternoon on the phone with Sandra reviewing the additional records Sandra had pulled overnight. And she'd spent 30 minutes before Marcus arrived, sitting quietly with her thoughts, composing herself, the way she'd once composed herself before depositions and board presentations, finding the still place in the center of herself where nothing could knock her off balance. He walked in, and she saw immediately that something had changed. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him. Not disheveled. Marcus didn't do disheveled, but underneath the controlled surface, something was fraying. His eyes had the specific quality of a man who hadn't slept well in a while, who was carrying something he hadn't figured out how to set down. Victoria. He sat in the chair without being invited. I owe you an honest conversation. You owe me several, she said, but go ahead. He leaned forward, clasped his hands. The Holloway investigation. I know about Palladian. Marcus. A silence. Something moved through his face, not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been dreading a door opening and has finally heard the handle turn. How much do you know? He said. Enough. She kept her voice level. I know about the shell companies. I know about the Cayman holding entity. I know about the Reed Group's financial exposure. She paused. I know that you knew about all of this when we got engaged. He was very still. Victoria, I want you to tell me one thing, she said. And I need you to understand that I will know if you're lying to me. I have been doing this for 12 years. I know what lying looks like. I know what it sounds like. And I need you to understand that the answer you give me in the next 30 seconds is going to determine everything that happens next. He looked at her. Ask, he said. Did you know about the accident? She said. Beforehand. Did you know what was going to happen on that highway? The room was absolutely quiet. She watched his face with everything she had, all 12 years of training, all the accumulated knowledge of what human beings look like when they are telling the truth and what they look like when they are constructing something around the edges of it. He looked away. That was her answer. Not. He stopped, pressed his hands flat against his knees, started again. Not the specifics. I swear to you, Victoria, I did not know specifically what they were going to do. I didn't order it. I didn't. His voice broke slightly. Recovered. I knew there was pressure. I knew people were worried about the investigation closing in. I knew there were conversations happening that I wasn't part of. He looked back at her. I should have warned you. I should have. He stopped. I told myself they wouldn't do anything. I told myself it was just talk, and then they did something, she said. He put his face in his hands. She looked at him. She looked at the man she'd planned to marry, the man she'd spent 3 years building a future with, sitting in a plastic rehabilitation center chair with his face in his hands, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not rage. Not the hot, immediate fury she would have predicted. Something quieter, and in some ways worse. A kind of grief. The grief of losing something twice, once in the accident, and once again now here in this room, in this conversation. You need to go to the federal investigators, she said. Not because I'm asking you to, because it's the right thing. And because the only way any of this gets better for anyone is if the truth comes out completely. He lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were wet. They'll destroy my family, he said. Your family destroyed themselves, she said, gently, without cruelty, just fact. He looked at her for a long time, at the wheelchair, at the woman he'd known before all of this, and was only now, she thought, actually seeing clearly. I'm sorry, he said. I know it's not enough. I know there's nothing I can say that... Go to the investigators, Marcus. She held his gaze. Do the one right thing. That's all I'm asking. He stood slowly. He looked old, she thought. Older than she'd ever seen him. He walked to the door and stopped. The man who visits you, he said. The one who drives you to appointments. He didn't turn around. He's good, whoever he is. A pause. Better than me. Then he left. Ethan came back from Chicago on Friday evening. He sat across from her in the consultation room she'd made her office and laid out what Garrett Walsh had told him calmly, completely, in the sequential way he did everything without drama and without omission. Walsh had confirmed what Sandra suspected. The truck driver's financials showed a cash deposit $40,000 made 11 days before the accident. Untraceable through standard channels, but Walsh had been in the FBI long enough to know the channels that weren't standard, and the origin point of that deposit connected to a financial management entity that connected through 2 more steps to Palladian's legal defense fund. $40,000. The number sat in the room between them like something physical. He's cooperating, Ethan said. The truck driver. Walsh reached him through a back channel. The man has been living with this for 6 weeks, and he's barely holding together. He's willing to talk if he gets protection. Victoria processed this. Walsh is taking it to the FBI field office in Chicago, Ethan continued. He's been coordinating with an agent there, a woman named Torres, who's been building a parallel case from the regulatory side. Between what Walsh has, what Sandra has, and what Torres has been building independently, they think they have enough to move. How fast? Torres said 2 weeks, maybe less. Ethan paused. Victoria, this is going to break wide open. I know. Are you ready for that? She looked at him. At this man who had driven to Chicago and hand-delivered documents and sat across from a former FBI investigator and come back and laid it out for her without making it about himself for a single moment. Are you? She asked. He seemed surprised by the question. It's not my fight. You've been in it for 6 weeks. That's different. How? He was quiet for a moment. You needed someone in your corner, he said finally. That's all this is. She shook her head slowly. That is not all this is, she said. And I think you know that. The room was quiet. Ethan. She said his name the way she meant it, directly, without cushioning. Why are you still here, not in this room, here? She held his gaze. You lost your wife. You rebuilt your life. You're a working man with your own life to run, and for 6 weeks you've been showing up at a rehabilitation center for a woman you met in a hospital corridor. She paused. Why? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, because when I walked into that room and saw you, I saw someone who was about to be left alone in the worst moment of her life. And I knew what that looked like. I knew what that did to a person. He paused. And I decided I wasn't going to be someone who walked past it. That's the reason you stayed for the first week, she said. What's the reason you're still here now? He looked at her steadily. You know the answer to that, he said. She did. She had known it for a while, in the particular way that honest people know things they haven't yet found the right moment to say. She'd been carrying it alongside everything else. The investigation, the therapy, the daily work of rebuilding herself in a body that had been fundamentally altered, carrying it carefully, not ready to name it, not sure what naming it would mean. I don't know what I can give you, she said, honest, the way she'd learned to be with him. I don't know who I am right now. I'm in the middle of all of this. I'm not the same person I was before the accident. I'm not sure yet who the person I'm becoming is going to be. I'm not asking you to know any of that, he said. Then what are you asking? He leaned forward slightly. I'm asking you to let me keep showing up, he said. That's all. Just let me keep showing up. Everything else figures itself out. Victoria Hayes had run a corporate investigation firm for 8 years. She had negotiated with some of the most difficult people in American business. She had sat across tables from men who lied to her face and seen through it every time, and she had built her professional life on the ability to assess situations clearly without sentiment distorting her judgment. She looked at Ethan Walker, and she assessed the situation, and her judgment told her that this man, this quiet, steady, ordinary, extraordinary man, was the most honest thing that had happened to her in years. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He nodded. And then her phone buzzed on the table, and it was Sandra. And the world outside them continued doing what it was going to do, moving toward the reckoning that was coming. The truth that was working its way to the surface, whether powerful people wanted it there or not. She answered the phone. Ethan picked up his coffee cup and waited. And that she thought was exactly what she meant. Torres moved in 11 days. Not 2 weeks. 11 days. Which told Victoria everything she needed to know about how solid the case actually was when federal investigators move faster than they said they would. It means they were already closer than they let on. It means the pieces they were waiting for arrived and fit exactly where they expected them to fit. She found out at 6:40 in the morning. Not from Torres directly, from the news. She was sitting in her room at the rehabilitation center. She'd been transferred to outpatient status 4 days earlier, but she kept the room for working because it had better light and fewer interruptions than her apartment, which she hadn't fully returned to yet, which still felt like a place that belonged to the person she'd been before, and her phone lit up with a news alert that said, "Federal agents raid Palladian Pharmaceuticals headquarters in 3 cities simultaneously." She read it twice. Then she called Sandra. Sandra picked up before the first ring finished. "I'm watching it live," Sandra said without preamble. "Chicago, New York, and Atlanta. They hit all 3 at the same time. Garrett Walsh is on the ground in Chicago. He texted me 10 minutes ago." A pause, and Victoria could hear the particular controlled excitement in Sandra's voice, the professional thrill of seeing something you've built for 8 months finally become real. "Victoria, it's happening." "Who's been named?" "Palladian's CEO and 2 board members in custody already. The legal team is scrambling. They're trying to get injunctions. But Torres filed in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously, and the judge in New York denied the first motion 12 minutes ago." Sandra paused. "And Victoria." Her voice shifted, became something more careful. "They announced this morning that a cooperating witness has provided testimony regarding the events of the accident. They didn't name Marcus publicly, but they said a cooperating witness with direct knowledge of the conspiracy." Victoria sat with that. "He went," she said. "It looks like it." "When?" "The filing timestamp is from 2 days ago. He must have gone the day after he came to see you. 2 days ago, while she'd been in therapy learning to transfer herself from the wheelchair to a car seat. While Ethan had been helping her navigate an inaccessible entrance to the attorney's office, where they'd met with her own legal team to prepare for exactly this moment. While all of that ordinary grinding daily work of survival had been happening, Marcus Reed had walked into a federal building and done the one right thing. "Okay," Victoria said. "Call our attorney. I want to be prepared when Torres contacts us directly. And Sandra." She paused. "Good work. Tell the team. All of them. They built this." "Yes, ma'am." She ended the call. She sat in the quiet of the room for a moment. The news alert was still on her phone screen. She looked at it, the headline, the photographs of the Palladian headquarters, building the banner running across the bottom of the video feed that said "Breaking" in red letters. Then she called Ethan. "I saw," he said when he answered. "Of course you did. How are you?" She considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to do, not as a social formality, but as an actual inquiry worth an actual answer. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me again in a few hours." "I'll bring coffee," he said. "Real coffee." "Please." He arrived 40 minutes later with coffee and a paper bag from the bakery, 3 blocks from the center, the one they'd discovered on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks ago when she'd needed air, and he'd pushed her wheelchair the 3 blocks without being asked. And they'd eaten pastries on a bench outside and talked about nothing important for 45 minutes, and it had been, she'd thought later, one of the better 45 minutes she'd had in months. He set the coffee on her tray table and sat in the chair. The same chair, always the same chair, as if he'd claimed it the first night, and it had simply remained his ever since. She looked at him. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking about all the patients," she said. "The ones in the clinical trials. The ones who took medications that didn't work the way the data said they would. The ones who made treatment decisions based on falsified information." She paused. "That's who this was always about. Not Marcus. Not my accident. Those people." Ethan nodded. "I've been so deep in the personal part of it," she continued. "The betrayal. What happened to me. What it meant. And I let myself get close to losing sight of why we started the Holloway investigation in the first place." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. 53 documented patient cases where adverse outcomes may be linked to the falsified trial data. 53. And those are just the ones we found. "The truth getting out doesn't undo the harm," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "But it stops more of it. And it makes the people responsible answer for it." She looked at him. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." Her phone buzzed. Torres. She held up a finger to Ethan and answered. The conversation with Agent Torres lasted 22 minutes. Torres was direct, thorough, and had the specific quality of someone who had been building toward this moment for a long time and wasn't going to waste it by being imprecise. She walked Victoria through what they needed from her firm in terms of formal testimony and documentation and what the likely timeline of prosecution looked like. When she got to Marcus, she was careful. "Mr. Reed's cooperation has been substantive," Torres said. He provided testimony regarding several conversations he'd been party to, in which the accident was discussed as a potential solution to the investigation timeline. He was not a decision-maker in that conversation. He was present. That distinction matters legally, though it doesn't change the moral dimension. "I understand," Victoria said. "His cooperation will be reflected in how we approach his exposure," Torres said. "I can't promise you outcomes, but I can tell you that the people who made the operational decisions about what happened to you are going to face serious federal charges, including attempted murder." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Attempted murder. She'd known that was what it was. She'd known it since 3 in the morning 6 weeks ago when she'd sat in the dark with Sandra's files open on her laptop. But hearing the words in a federal agent's voice, hearing them spoken as legal fact, rather than as her own terrible suspicion, did something to the air in the room. "Thank you, Agent Torres," she said. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Your firm's work made this possible." She ended the call. Ethan was watching her. She set the phone down. She looked at her hands. She breathed. "Attempted murder," she said. "Yeah." "They're going to be charged with attempted murder." "Yeah." She looked up at him. "I don't feel what I thought I'd feel," she said. "I thought there would be—" She stopped. "I thought it would feel like something resolved, like something closing." She shook her head slightly. "It just feels like the beginning of a very long thing." "It is," Ethan said. "The legal part is just starting. The rest of it—" He paused. "The rest of it you've already been living." She considered that. "Are you glad it's out?" he asked. "Yes." No hesitation. "Whatever comes next, yes. I'd rather know. I'd rather it be real and visible and something that can be dealt with than something I suspected and couldn't prove." She looked at him steadily. "I've spent the last 6 weeks being afraid of a lot of things, Ethan, but I've never been afraid of the truth." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but had warmth in it. The one that said without words that he believed her completely. The story broke nationally by noon. By 2. In the afternoon, it had become the kind of story that takes on its own momentum. The kind where other journalists start pulling connected threads, where former Palladian employees start giving background interviews, where legal analysts appear on every cable news channel to explain what the charges meant and what the likely consequences were. By 4, someone had connected the CEO of Hayes Investigations to the Palladian case. By 5, Victoria's name was in 3 national news outlets. By 6, her phone had received 47 calls from numbers she didn't recognize, 11 from journalists she'd dealt with professionally over the years, and 1 from her former business partner Alan Marsh, who had stopped calling approximately 2 weeks after the accident and whom she had not spoken to since. She didn't answer Alan's call. She let Sandra handle the press. Sandra, it turned out, was extremely good at talking to journalists, direct, informative, and skilled at giving them enough that they felt satisfied while protecting the information that needed protecting. Victoria had always known Sandra was good. She was realizing now exactly how good. What she did not anticipate was the second wave. It started with a piece in a national publication, a journalist who had been following the pharmaceutical fraud story for months from the regulatory angle, and who had now connected it to the accident, to Victoria, to the human story, underneath the corporate scandal. The piece ran online at 7:30 that evening and led not with the legal charges, but with a single sentence that Victoria read and then read again. The woman who built the case that brought down Palladian Pharmaceuticals did it from a wheelchair in a rehabilitation center after surviving the assassination attempt the company arranged to stop her. Her phone didn't stop ringing after that. She sat in the consultation room with Ethan beside her and her laptop open and watched the story spread with the particular surreal quality of seeing your own life become public property. Comment sections filling up. People she'd never met expressing outrage on her behalf. Admiration. Anger at Palladian, questions about the investigation, personal stories about family members who had been in the clinical trials. 53 documented cases. Now by morning, there would be more. "You okay?" Ethan said. "I'm watching strangers argue about my spine on the internet," she said. "I'm not sure okay is the right framework." Fair point. She closed the laptop. "Can we go somewhere?" she said. "Not the diner, somewhere that doesn't have Wi-Fi." He stood immediately. "I know a place." It was a park, not a grand one. Just the kind of neighborhood park that existed in the spaces between city blocks, with mature trees and benches, and the particular quietness of a place that people passed through, rather than came to deliberately. Ethan had been there before, he said. He'd gone there sometimes in the months after his wife died, when the apartment felt like too much, and he'd needed somewhere to exist without the weight of every familiar thing. He pushed her wheelchair along the path without being asked. She'd stopped noticing when he did things like that, or rather she noticed, but the noticing had shifted. It wasn't the charged, complicated thing it had been in the early weeks when every act of physical assistance had felt like a reminder of what she'd lost. It had become something else, something quieter. It had become simply the way things were between them, the natural shorthand of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. They stopped near a bench under one of the larger trees. He sat on the bench. She settled the wheelchair beside it close enough that they were at the same level, looking in the same direction. For a while, they didn't talk. The evening was cool. The kind of clear, still autumn evening, where the air has a specific quality that makes everything feel slightly more present than usual, more real. "My wife's name was Claire," Ethan said. He said it into the quiet, not turning to look at her, like something he'd been carrying and had decided it was time to set down. Victoria waited. She was a teacher, 4th grade. She was the best person I've ever known. Not complicated, not brilliant in the way that gets written about, just genuinely good. The kind of person who makes everyone around her want to be slightly better than they are. He paused. She was sick for 18 months. And during those 18 months, I watched every plan we'd made, every future we'd built in our heads. I watched all of it shift into something we didn't recognize. And then she died, and I had to figure out who I was after that. "How long did it take?" Victoria asked. "I'm still figuring it out," he said. He looked at her then. "But I know more now than I did 3 years ago. And one of the things I know is that the life you planned isn't always the life you end up with, and sometimes the one you end up with." He paused. "Sometimes it's better, different, but better. She looked at him. I didn't plan this, she said. She gestured at herself at the wheelchair at the general scope of the last 2 months. None of this. I know. I had a very specific picture of what my life was going to look like. I know that too. And now, she stopped. Now I'm a person who reads about herself in national newspapers and can't walk and is apparently in the middle of the biggest federal prosecution of the year and has... She paused. And has you, who I also didn't plan. He said nothing. I don't know what to do with that, she said, honest the way she always was with him. I don't know what to do with any of it yet. You don't have to know tonight, he said. I know I don't. She looked at her hands in her lap. But I want you to understand that when I said I don't know what I can give you, I meant it. And I also meant that I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I'm not pushing you away. I just need you to know what you're staying for. Not a version of me that existed before the accident. Not a version that's going to suddenly be the same person she was. This version. She met his eyes. The one who sits in a wheelchair and threw a vase at a doctor and is currently in the middle of a federal case and cried in a hospital room in front of a stranger. Ethan looked at her steadily. Victoria, he said. That's the only version I know. She held his gaze. I know, he continued, that you're in the middle of the hardest stretch of your life. I know that, and I'm not asking you to be anywhere different than where you are. I'm not waiting for some future version of you. I'm here because... He stopped. Exhaled. Because you are the most honest, most determined, most genuinely impressive person I've met in a very long time. And because sitting next to you, even in the hard parts, especially in the hard parts, is the most awake I've felt in years. The park was quiet around them. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while, not saying anything, not needing to. The evening settled around them, and the city moved at its own pace, somewhere beyond the trees, and the federal case that would occupy the next year of their lives was sitting in federal filing systems across 3 cities, and the truth that Victoria had nearly died to uncover was spreading across every news platform in the country. And here in this small park, it was quiet. The weeks that followed were anything but. Torres's team moved quickly once the first round of arrests happened. Palladian's legal defense began the complicated, expensive, ultimately futile process of trying to contain the damage. One board member flipped within the first week. Then a senior vice president. Then the clinical research director, who had apparently been wanting to talk to someone for 3 years and had simply been waiting for the moment when not talking became more dangerous than talking. The truck driver, a 51-year-old man from Indiana named Gary Pruitt, who had a wife and a mortgage and a gambling problem that had made him vulnerable to $40,000 in cash, gave a full recorded statement. He told Torres's investigators everything. The contact, the money, the instructions. The specific stretch of highway, the specific window of time. He had believed he said that he was supposed to cause a minor accident. A fender bender. Something that would put the woman out of commission for a few weeks without seriously hurting anyone. Victoria listened to the summary of his statement in Torres's office with Ethan beside her and her own attorney to her left. And she thought about Gary Pruitt for a long time afterward. About what it meant to be the person whose desperation someone else had identified and weaponized. About the distance between what he'd intended and what had actually happened to her. About whether that distance made her angrier or whether it somehow made the whole thing more unbearable. The knowledge that her spine, her legs, her life, as she'd known it, had been taken from her by a calculation that had simply gone further than the people making it had planned. She didn't share most of that with anyone except Ethan. She shared it with him on a Tuesday night in her apartment. She'd moved fully back in 3 weeks after the arrests, because the rehabilitation center room had served its purpose, and she needed to reclaim her own space, her own routines, the familiar geography of her own life, configured around her new reality. He sat on her couch, while she sat in the wheelchair across from him, and she talked about Gary Pruitt, and he listened in the way he always listened. When she finished, he said, What are you going to do with it? What do you mean? The anger. He paused. All of it. What are you going to do with it? She thought about it seriously. I'm going to put it into the testimony, she said finally. When it goes to trial, I'm going to get on the stand, figuratively speaking, and I'm going to say everything clearly and completely and let the jury see what it cost. She paused. And then I'm going to let the legal system do what it's designed to do and move forward. And Gary Pruitt. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I know he didn't intend this. I know he was desperate and stupid and that he had no idea what the people using him were actually capable of. She paused. I'm not ready to forgive him, but I'm also not going to let the question of whether I forgive him be the thing that defines how I move through the next part of my life. Ethan nodded. That's wise, he said. Or maybe just practical, she said. Anger is expensive. I've got other things to spend the energy on. He looked at her with that expression, the one she knew now had memorized without meaning, to the one that lived in the specific warmth around his eyes. You know what I see when I look at you, he said. Don't say someone who's going to be okay, she said. I hate when people say that. I wasn't going to, he said. I was going to say someone who was already okay. Someone who has been okay this whole time, even in the moments when she wasn't. Someone who bent but didn't break and who is... He stopped, looked at her directly. Remarkable. That's the word, just remarkable. Victoria looked at him. She had spent her career being called formidable, ambitious, relentless, driven. Words that were accurate and that she'd earned, but that always carried with them a slight edge. An implication that these qualities were somehow in tension with something warmer, something more human. Remarkable. The way Ethan said it didn't have that edge. It just meant exactly what it said. Come here, she said. He moved from the couch to the chair beside her, close within arm's reach, and she looked at him for a moment. This man who had walked into her broken world without a single agenda and had stayed simply because staying was what the moment needed. And because she understood now, he was the kind of person who recognized what was worth staying for. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was quiet and careful and real. The kind of kiss that isn't the beginning of something so much as the acknowledgement of something that has been building for a long time and has finally become undeniable. When she pulled back, he looked at her with something open and unguarded in his face that she thought she could spend a long time looking at. Took us a while, he said. I needed to be sure, she said. Of what? That I wasn't doing it because I needed you, she said. I wanted to be sure I was doing it because I wanted you. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. And, he said. She held his gaze. I want you, she said. Simply, directly, with the complete honesty that had always been the thing she gave him, that she gave almost no one else. Specifically, not just someone, you. He reached out and took her hand. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. And it was enough. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace. The Palladian trial was 3 months away. The testimony was being prepared. Sandra was working 18-hour days coordinating with Torres's team. The national story continued to develop and expand. 41 additional patient cases had been identified and connected to the falsified trial data, bringing the total to 94. All of that was real and present and waiting. And here in her apartment, in the quiet of an ordinary Tuesday night, Victoria Hayes held the hand of a man she hadn't planned on, in a life she hadn't planned, and found to her genuine surprise that what she felt was not resignation. What she felt was something that had no business being there given everything. What she felt was grateful. The trial began on a Monday in March. Victoria knew it would be hard. She had prepared for hard. She had spent 3 months in depositions and meetings with Torres and the federal prosecution team, in long evenings at her dining room table with Sandra and their legal counsel, reviewing testimony and building the evidentiary narrative that the jury would need to follow. She had done everything a person could do to be ready. Bull. What she hadn't fully prepared for was walking into that courthouse, being wheeled into that courthouse, through the wide accessible entrance on the south side of the building that Ethan had scouted 2 days earlier, and feeling the weight of every single person in that space turned toward her. The press was outside in numbers she hadn't anticipated. Cameras and journalists and the particular energy of a story that had grown over the preceding months from a corporate fraud case into something that had captured the country's attention in a deeper way. It wasn't just about Palladian anymore. It was about what Palladian represented, about what happened when the people responsible for protecting public health decided that their own financial exposure mattered more than the lives of the patients who trusted them. About 94 documented cases. About falsified data and silenced researchers, and a woman who had nearly been killed for getting close enough to find the truth. The cameras caught her on the courthouse steps. She knew they would. She didn't look away from them. She had decided in the weeks leading up to the trial that she was not going to make herself smaller. She was not going to angle the wheelchair out of frame or position herself so that the disability was less visible, or perform the kind of stoic minimization that she'd seen other public figures do when their physical limitations became part of their public story. She was not going to pretend. She was Victoria Hayes. She was in a wheelchair. Both of those things were simply true. Ethan was behind her, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, not steering, just present. The way he always was. She reached back briefly and put her hand over his, just for a moment, and then they went inside. The prosecution's opening statement lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The lead prosecutor, a composed, precise woman named Linda Okafor, who had been trying federal cases for 20 years and had the specific quality of someone who understood exactly how much weight each word carried, walked the jury through the entire architecture of the fraud. The clinical trials, the falsified data, the researchers who had raised concerns and been quietly removed, the regulators who had been compensated for their silence, the patients who had made life-altering medical decisions based on information that had been deliberately manufactured. And then she got to Victoria. She described the investigation, Hayes Investigation's 8-month process of building the case, the layers of shell companies, the financial connections to the Reed Group, the moment when the investigation reached a threshold of completion that made certain powerful people feel that it needed to be stopped. She described the accident. She described Gary Pruitt's testimony, the $40,000, the phone calls, the specific instructions, the stretch of highway on a rainy Thursday night. She described what the accident had done to Victoria Hayes's spine. When Okafor finished that section, she paused. She let the room sit in the silence for several seconds. Then she said, "The defendants did not succeed in stopping the truth. What they succeeded in doing was taking away a woman's ability to walk. And this court is going to hold them accountable for both." Victoria sat in the gallery and kept her face composed and felt Ethan's hand find hers in the space between their seats. She held on. She testified on the 4th day. She had been on a witness stand before many times in depositions and proceedings connected to her firm's cases. She was not someone who was frightened of being questioned. But this was different in a way she hadn't fully anticipated, because this time it was her body that was the evidence. This time, the story she was telling wasn't about documents and financial records. It was about a rainy Thursday night, and 3 days of unconsciousness, and a doctor's voice, and a wheelchair, and everything that had come after. Okafor led her through it methodically. The investigation's timeline, the evidence they'd built, the moment Sandra had found the connection to the Reed Group, the conversation with Marcus, what she had understood, and when she had understood it, and what she had done with that understanding. Bapu. And then the defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Hargrove, who was very good at his job and who had been trying throughout the first 4 days to build a narrative in which the accident was a tragedy, but not a conspiracy, in which the financial connections were coincidental, in which his clients were being scapegoated by a woman looking for someone to blame for her misfortune, stood up and walked toward the witness stand. He began carefully. He questioned the certainty of her financial analysis. He questioned the interpretation of the Shell Company connections. He questioned the reliability of Gary Pruitt as a witness, implying that a man who had taken $40,000 in cash was not a man whose testimony should be trusted. Victoria answered every question directly and completely, and without defensiveness. She had prepared for every angle Hargrove was going to take, and she met each one with the same calm, factual precision she had applied to 12 years of professional investigation. Then Hargrove changed direction. He walked to the edge of the jury box and turned to face her with the particular expression of a man who is about to try something he believes will work. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "isn't it possible, given your personal relationship with Marcus Reed, given the end of your engagement, given everything you experienced as a result of this accident, isn't it possible that what you have built here is not an investigation, but a vendetta?" The courtroom was very quiet. Victoria looked at him. "Dem." She let the silence sit for exactly 4 seconds, long enough that the jury felt it, long enough that the weight of what was being implied was fully present in the room. Then she said, "Mr. Hargrove, I have been a professional investigator for 12 years. In that time I have investigated people I liked and people I disliked, companies I admired and companies I despised. In every case, the outcome of my investigation was determined by the evidence, not by my feelings." She paused. "The evidence in this case is what it is. The financial connections are documented. The communications are documented. Mr. Pruitt's testimony is corroborated by phone records and financial transactions that existed before I was ever involved in this case." She held Hargrove's gaze. "You're welcome to call it a vendetta. The evidence calls it the truth." Hargrove held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions," and sat down. In the gallery she heard very faintly, quickly suppressed, what sounded like someone exhaling in a way that was almost applause. She didn't look for Ethan's face. She knew what she would find there. Marcus testified on the 7th day. He came in looking like a man who had made peace with a particular kind of consequence, not defeated, not broken, but stripped of the polished certainty that had always been his primary presentation. He wore a plain dark suit. His hair was not quite as perfect as it used to be. He looked, Victoria thought, watching him from across the room, like someone who had put down something very heavy and was still learning to move without the weight of it. He told the truth, all of it. The financial connections he'd known about. The conversations he'd been present for in which the investigation had been discussed as a threat. The specific conversation 3 weeks before the accident, in which one of the now indicted board members had said, with the particular casual brutality of men who had never faced consequences for anything, that the Hayes problem needed to be resolved. He told the jury that he had not believed in that moment that they were actually going to do anything. That he had told himself it was posturing. That he had made the choice in the days that followed to not ask more questions because not asking was easier than knowing, and because knowing would have required him to do something. He said, "I chose not to know. And because I chose not to know, I chose not to act. And because I didn't act, a woman I claimed to love almost died." He didn't look at Victoria when he said it. She thought that was probably the right choice. When Hargrove cross-examined Marcus and tried with diminishing effectiveness to paint him as a man who was trading testimony for leniency, and whose account should therefore be discounted, Marcus looked at the jury and said, "I am testifying because it's the truth. Whatever it costs me, it's the truth. I'm tired of choosing comfortable things over true ones." Victoria looked at her hands in her lap when he said that. She thought about 3 years. About the ring in the bedside drawer that she'd eventually moved to a box in the closet without ceremony or drama. About what it meant to love someone and not know them. About what it meant to know someone and love them anyway. She thought about Ethan. She thought about the difference. The verdicts came on a Thursday afternoon, 8 weeks after the trial began. Guilty on all primary counts. The CEO. Both board members. The clinical research director. The regulatory liaison, who had facilitated the payments to the FDA officials. Guilty, 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 guilty. Sentencing to follow in 60 days. Victoria was in the courthouse when the jury filed back in. She sat in the front row of the gallery with Sandra on one side and Ethan on the other, and Garrett Walsh directly behind her, and she listened to the foreperson read the verdicts one by one with the flat declarative finality of legal language, and she felt each one land somewhere in her chest, like something coming to rest after a very long flight. When it was over, when the judge had thanked the jury, and the room had erupted into the controlled chaos of a verdict being received, Sandra grabbed her hand and was crying, which Victoria had never seen in 6 years, and which undid her slightly. Walsh put both hands on her shoulders from behind and said, "You did it. You actually did it." And Ethan. Ethan just looked at her steady and present, and completely himself, and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment needed. She took a breath. "We did it," she said. Meaning all of them. Meaning Sandra and Walsh and Torres and the federal prosecutors and the researchers who had finally felt safe enough to tell the truth, and the 94 patients whose stories had become part of the record. We did. Outside the courthouse, the cameras found her. She stopped. Ethan had started to push her past them toward the waiting car, and she put her hand on the wheel to stop herself, and she turned to face the cameras. She didn't have a prepared statement. She hadn't planned this. She said, "The people responsible for falsifying clinical trial data, for corrupting regulators, and for arranging a criminal act to silence this investigation have been found guilty by a jury of their peers. That matters. Not because it repairs what was done, but because it establishes that what was done was wrong, and that there are consequences for wrong things, even when the people doing them believe they are too powerful to face those consequences." She paused. "To the patients and families connected to this case, you were never forgotten. You were always the reason." She turned the wheelchair, and they moved toward the car. 6 months later, Victoria gave a speech. It wasn't planned as the speech it became. She'd been asked to speak at a benefit gala for a foundation supporting people with spinal cord injuries, an organization she'd begun working with in the months after the trial, because the case had connected her to people whose experiences with disability were not so different from her own, and because she had discovered that the work of rebuilding a life after catastrophic injury was work that nobody should have to do alone, and that very few people had enough resources to do well. The room was large. Several hundred people. Journalists, because her name still carried the weight of the Palladian case, and because this was the kind of story that continued to generate coverage. Donors. Foundation staff, and people in wheelchairs and on crutches, and with the various visible and invisible marks of bodies that had been changed by circumstance or accident or illness, people who had come because this foundation had helped them, or because they hoped it would. She'd written notes. She abandoned them at the podium. She looked out at the room and she thought about the doctor's voice, about the specific sentence that had arrived like a verdict before she'd had a chance to understand what she was on trial for. "You'll never walk again, Ms. Hayes." She thought about the vase of white lilies scattered across a hospital floor. She thought about a stranger's knock on an open door, about bad coffee in a paper cup, about a plastic chair that somehow became the steadiest place she'd ever stood. She said, "A doctor told me I would never walk again. He was right." The room was very quiet. "I want to start with that," she continued, "because I think the version of this story that gets told most often, the inspiring version, the comeback version, tends to skip over that part, tends to suggest that determination and the right people around you, and enough hard work can somehow override the reality of what a spinal cord injury means. And I don't want to tell you that story, because it isn't true, and because the people in this room deserve better than a story that makes it seem like the goal is to transcend your disability, rather than to build a full life within it." She paused. "My legs don't work. That is a permanent fact about my life. There are things I cannot do that I could do before. There are accommodations I require that I didn't used to require. There are days when the weight of what was taken from me is so present that it is hard to see around it." She looked at the room steadily. "I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's true, and because honesty about the hard parts is the only thing that makes the rest of what I'm going to tell you worth anything." She found Ethan in the audience. He was near the back, slightly off-center, sitting in the same quietly present way. He sat everywhere, not performing attention, just giving it. Their eyes met briefly. She continued. 8 months ago, I sat in a hospital room and believed that my life was over. Not because I'd been told I wouldn't walk. Because I looked around that room and understood that I was going to face what was coming alone. My fiancé was already retreating. My business partners had stopped calling. The people I'd built my professional and personal world around were demonstrating in the specific and unmistakable way that only crisis reveals, that their presence in my life had been contingent on my being a certain kind of person, capable, functional, unencumbered. And I was no longer that person. She stopped. And then a man knocked on my open door. She didn't look at Ethan again. She didn't need to. He didn't know me. He didn't have a reason to be there. He had heard someone crying in a hospital room, and he had made the decision, the specific, deliberate, countercultural decision, to not keep walking. To sit down. To stay. She paused. He didn't fix anything. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He brought me decent coffee and asked me what I wanted, and he listened to the answer, and he came back the next day. The room was completely still. He came back the next day, she repeated. That sounds small. It wasn't small. It was everything. She let that sit for a moment. I built a case that put powerful people in federal prison. I ran that investigation from a rehabilitation center, from a wheelchair, from a state of physical and emotional reconstruction that I would not wish on anyone. I am genuinely proud of that work. She paused. But the thing that made it possible, the thing that made any of it possible, was not my own determination. It was not even my team, though my team was extraordinary. It was the fact that I had one person in my life who looked at my wheelchair and saw me. Who looked at everything that had been taken from me and saw everything that remained. Who decided without being asked that he was going to be present for the hard part. Her voice held steady. She'd worked to make sure it would. The doctor was right about my legs, she said. But he was wrong about my life. My life wasn't over. It was just being rebuilt into something I hadn't planned. And the rebuilding, she paused. The rebuilding turned out to be the most important thing I've ever done. Because what I built the second time was truer than what I had before. Truer and stronger, and a great deal better. She looked out at the room one final time. Find your people, she said. Not the ones who show up when you're successful. The ones who show up when you're broken. The ones who sit down in the hard room and stay. They exist. I promise you they exist. A pause. And if you are someone who is capable of being that person for someone else. If you have ever walked past a hospital room and heard someone crying behind a door, I am asking you to knock. I am asking you to sit down. I am asking you to stay. The applause started before she finished the last sentence. She sat in it for a moment, and then she moved the wheelchair back from the podium and found Ethan at the edge of the stage where he'd moved without being asked, waiting to help navigate the accessible ramp on the left side. He looked at her. Good speech, he said. You helped write it, she said, without knowing it. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, warm, solid, exactly what it was. Ready, he said. She looked out at the room, at the people still applauding, at Sandra wiping her eyes in the third row, at Garrett Walsh, who had somehow gotten an invitation and was standing in the back with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing that men do when they're moved and have decided they're not going to show it. At all the faces she didn't recognize the strangers who had come to this room carrying their own versions of broken and rebuilt and ongoing. She thought about a rainy Thursday night. She thought about everything it had cost. She thought about what it had given her in the terrible, ironic way that loss sometimes gives things, not, instead of what you had not in compensation, but simply as what grows in the space that getting stripped down to the truth leaves behind. She thought about Ethan. She turned to face forward. Ready, she said. Detty and Victoria Hayes, CEO, investigator, wheelchair user, survivor. The woman who had nearly been destroyed by powerful men, and had instead destroyed them. The woman who had learned that strength was not the absence of need, but the willingness to let the right people meet. It rolled forward into the rest of her life. Not walking. Never walking. But moving. Always moving. And beside her, steady as the first day he'd sat down in a plastic hospital chair with a paper cup of decent coffee and decided that someone else's hard room was worth staying in. Ethan Walker kept pace. That was the whole story. That was enough.